Hello, everyone. This is Michael with Reason and Theology. I am delighted to be joined by guest Father Patrick Cardine, a Western Orthodox priest. Father Patrick, thank you for coming on. How are you today?
Very good, Chris. Thanks for having me.
Good, indeed. I'm delighted. We had a little bit of technical difficulties there, but we made it through. So very glad that you're here. Um, I'd like to first start out by asking you, how did you become a priest? And maybe if you could also speak on how you became an Orthodox.
Well, I grew up in a pretty pious home, and I think in my late teens I started to feel a call to work in the church. I grew up in an evangelical Southern Baptist, actually, and
Mhm.
so from a pretty young age I felt called to the ministry. But it took 20 years to become Orthodox, so it was not until 2006, 2007 that I was made a priest in the Orthodox Church. I had been a priest in the Charismatic Episcopal Church for 10 years prior to that, and had been started pastoring in 1980, 86, 87. So had been in ministry, in Christian ministry for a long time before I became Orthodox. But
You said with the Charismatics?
yeah, it was. This was basically a group that started in the early 90s, and they were essentially a group of evangelical charismatics who were searching for traditional apostolic Christianity, sort of a parallel group to the EOC, the Evangelical Orthodox.
Mhm.
And so we were similar to that. Convergence movement, if you've ever heard of that, back in the 1980s, we were part of that. And so that one thing led to another, and that was sort of a stepping stone, a bridge for me to get into Orthodoxy.
Okay. And so I see that you're a Western Orthodox priest, and maybe just kind of educate us as far as what Western Orthodoxy is. I'm not sure that, everybody watching really is familiar with it. So what exactly is Western Orthodoxy?
Well, I probably wouldn't say Western Orthodoxy. We're Orthodox. We're part of the Antiochian Archdiocese, and so we're Orthodox first. But we were given permission and I guess you might even call it a project within Eastern Orthodoxy to reestablish living tradition of the liturgical tradition of the West, the Western Church, and so we serve the Western Rite as Orthodox Christians. But if my bishop told me tomorrow that they were going to do away with the Western Rite, I'd just
Mhm.
get out my Byzantine vestments and dust them off, and brush up on the liturgicon
Yeah,
and get to work. But I wouldn't be happy about it. But
right.
that's what I would do.
So you're actually able to perform services in the Eastern Orthodox Church according to the Byzantine rite. Is that correct?
Well, I would use the term able very loosely. I
Mm.
don't think I'd be much good at it. But in theory, yes, I'm an
Okay.
Orthodox priest,
Mhm.
and if I go down to the local Byzantine church across the street, the priest expects me to bring my vestments and vest and serve with him in the altar. So
Okay.
um, there's no disconnect there.
Yeah. Well, tell me why there was maybe a need to reestablish the Western or Latin rite in Orthodoxy. What exactly was the need behind this?
Well, initially these things generally come about from a practical point of view, usually not theoretical or abstract. It's because somebody approached the church and said, "We want to become Orthodox, but we're." This was actually what happened. We're Anglican. Can we keep our liturgies and still be Orthodox? So there was a request made, and this request was taken to the Moscow Synod in the early 1900s, and they studied they studied the request for years. They looked at the materials, the liturgies that were submitted to them, and they approved this. That's one instance. This, you know, the the project of bringing the Latin Rite back into Orthodoxy has had lots of stops and starts, and it's a
Mm.
long checkered history. We have an article on our webpage, The Orthodox West, which is a very good article that gives a brief but pretty thorough timeline of what happened in terms of bringing the Latin Rite back into Orthodoxy. But it
Mhm.
began as a practical issue in that people in the West, as traditional Orthodox peoples, moved into the West. and immigrated, people in the West became more familiar with Eastern Orthodoxy, and they became convinced that this is what they wanted to be, that this was the fullness of the church, and they wanted to be Orthodox. But they began to ask the question, if this is the Catholic faith, why can't I retain my Western traditional liturgical heritage and still be Orthodox? And as that question was posed to the hierarchs and our bishops, they reviewed it and they said, why not? This belongs to us as much as anybody else. So it was agreed to bring it back into the church. Now, from there, they began to develop sort of a rationale for why this is important, which really gets, I think, more to the heart of your question. And a lot of people will say it's important for missionary purposes to make Orthodoxy accessible to people in the West, because the Eastern Rite is too foreign or too exotic or too different for people in the West. I think that is, it's not a bad reason. It's one of the reasons, but a tertiary. It's not the most important reason. For me, the most important reason is to bear witness of our Catholicity. If we claim to be the Catholic faith for all people in all times, we can't just sort of lop off half of holy tradition in the West and pretend like it's not a part of us or doesn't exist. And if we're going to have, Florovsky talked about a patristic synthesis, of the fathers, and he meant by that, at least in part, that the Latin fathers had to be folded back into our living experience, and not just reading their writings, but as Orthodox Christians, for us, that means primarily a liturgical living experience, that we have to engage them in our worship, in our hymns, and our prayers, and particularly in the Mass. And so if we're going to see, the holy tradition of the Church as it was breathed and lived in the Latin West, as a part of our life in, everyday Orthodox life, there has to be, I think, rationally, there has to be a liturgical, reconstitution of the liturgy in our daily lives from the Western liturgy, the Latin liturgy. So it's to bear witness to our Catholicity and our wholeness. It gives us binocular vision.
Sure.
It gives us Catholicity. It's not that we don't have Catholicity without it, but this is a very sensitive thing to talk about, because somebody might say, well, it sounds like you're saying Orthodoxy is deficient without a Western Rite, or it's less than whole. Well, we can still be whole, full people by the mercy of God, but it still doesn't make it right.
And you're just basically saying this expresses the universality of the Orthodox Church better than just having a uniform Byzantine liturgy.
Yeah, it's that simple.
And even just historically, in the East, there wasn't just one liturgy. It was pretty, various in nature. It wasn't until after, I want to say, the Fourth Crusade that it became more uniform. Is that correct?
Sure. I mean, both East and West, there were, having a singular homogeneous liturgy is not in the spirit of Orthodoxy or Catholicity at all.
Yeah.
There were numerous liturgies, both East and West.
Right.
I think they were serving the liturgy of St. James in Antioch, the hometown of St. John Chrysostom, up through the 12th century.
Yeah, and basically any cathedral that you would go to, there would just be a rite according to whatever bishop was there. So you would have the Parisian rite or the Sauron rite, or just differed according to diocese. Not that they were just extremely, different or anything like that, but there were differences between them. At least that's from what I could see historically. But correct me if I'm wrong. It kind of seems like this would be, Western Orthodoxy would be the Orthodox version of Eastern Catholicism. If an Eastern Orthodox were to want to join the Roman Catholic Church but continue to bring that patrimony, they would be in the Eastern Catholic Church, where they continue to have, an Eastern Rite and Liturgy, and even Code of Canon Law, but they're in communion with the Pope. This would seem to be the inverse of that. Would you say that that's pretty accurate, or would you maybe take issue with that?
Well, there's some similarities on a liturgical front, but the whole uniate situation and the Eastern Catholics, Byzantine Catholics, and the complexities, the politics, the the bad blood, and all the water under the bridge with all of that comes along with that comparison is can be very misleading and send people down a wrong path to making wrong comparisons, because none of that applies. None of sort of that backstory, the politics don't apply. Strictly though, on a liturgical level, you could draw a parallel.
Okay.
So I think that's very important, because I think a lot of people accuse us of being reverse units. And that there's no comparison. It's apples and oranges. It's not even. It's apples and elephants. It's not even,
not even apples and oranges. No, well, let me ask you this. You mentioned that this came from Anglicans who wanted to join the Orthodox Church but kind of preserve their patrimony. So would you say that the liturgy that you serve is more a reflection of the Book of Common Prayer, or is it more of a reflection of the Roman Missal?
The liturgy that we serve, we have a choice. At St. Patrick's, we serve the Roman liturgy. So there's sort of two streams, liturgical streams within the Western Rite. There's one that relies a little bit more on the Anglican patrimony, and there's one that's more in line with the Roman Rite. And so we have a choice. To your average layperson coming to Mass, the Missal is different, but a lot of people wouldn't even notice it. It's relatively slight. I mean, for a liturgical geek or somebody who's serving, they're going to notice the differences. There's a few different prayers, but for your average person in the pew, they're not even going to know the difference. So they're not wildly different. Now, if there's somebody on here listening who's a liturgical geek, they're going to take issue with that, say, point out all the differences. But we use the liturgy of St. Gregory in the vernacular in English. We basically use the Missal, the Knot Missal, 1958 Knot Missal, which was the English translation of the Latin, basically the Tridentine Mass.
I recall reading Adrian Fortescue, a Roman Catholic theologian and historian, who noted that the Roman Catholic liturgy, especially that which we see culminated in Trent, that it really derived from the liturgy of Gregory, St. Gregory the Great, which you just noted.
Right.
But then I've also heard in the Eastern Orthodox Church that the liturgy of the pre-sanctified gifts is pretty much derived from the liturgy of Gregory the Great. Which one of those is true and which one of those is false? Because they don't seem to be at all alike.
Yeah, the first is true. The second is a misunderstanding. The pre-sanctified liturgy is referred to as being derived from St. Gregory, but it's not. It's obvious. It's obviously very different. I don't know where that association came from, but it's not that the association is wrong. There must be some meaning behind it, something important, but I don't know the answer to that. But it's certainly It's certainly different.
Now, you said that you use the Roman Missal. You kind of have the option of using a more Anglican version, but then you can also use the Roman Missal. Well, how do you deal with the fact that the papacy is so central to Western liturgy and Western patrimony, and you have this Western patrimony in your church, but it's, there's right now not communion between the Eastern Orthodox Church and the Roman Pontiff. How do you maybe deal with that tension? Because I imagine you read Western saints and you come across their views on the papacy a lot. How do you deal with that tension?
Well, it actually doesn't show up in the liturgy much at all. In fact, I mean, if there were later collects that were in there, we don't those are not part of our propers. The propers are the movable parts of the Mass, depending on what Mass you're saying. So any collects that would recognize, certain papal doctrines that would not be in line with Orthodox, belief or practice, they're just not there. So liturgically, there is no tension. I mean, it doesn't exist. we don't say the filioque,
Mhm.
and that was about it. So we had to remove one word, basically.
Okay.
There were our bishops added, I believe and I confess, a prayer for St. John Chrysostom, not because of any deficiency in the Latin Mass, but because strictly, if Byzantines were visiting a Western Rite service, this was a prayer that they would
Mhm.
recognize, and it would make
Mhm.
them feel a little bit more at home. So that was a
Sure. Fair
reason
enough.
for adding that.
Yeah.
The epiclesis was also added. That's a whole
Mhm.
nother topic, which if you want to talk about, we can.
Oh, yeah.
Before getting into that, I want to
Yeah.
answer your question about the papacy. For me, on a practical level, I have not felt this tension, at all. I'm Orthodox, and with the Immaculate Conception doctrine, I think, let me draw a parallel there.
Mhm.
One of the objections that people, put forth in terms of the Immaculate Conception of the Blessed Virgin Mary is that if she was preserved from sin from the time of her conception, this makes her less than human. Well, this shocks me every time I hear this, because this is one of the more, quite frankly, ridiculous and
Yeah.
foolish, arguments. I'm thinking, so for in some people's minds, sin is proper to humanity.
Right.
Whereas, so if she's without sin,
Mhm.
she's not human. Whereas we know just the opposite is true.
Right.
That because of sin, we might be said to be subhuman.
Mhm.
We're not fully human because
Mhm.
of sin, and she is a human being. I mean, our mother Eve and our father Adam were humans apart from sin, and so corollary to that, I would say, to embrace the Latin Western patrimony apart from what we would consider spurious later papal
Mm.
doctrines,
Mhm.
does no violence, or there's no tension or problem with
Mhm.
that, with us fully embracing, apostolic Western tradition.
Yeah, fair enough.
So
Now, what would you do as far as confirmation and paedo communion? Because those, of course, are going to be practiced in the Eastern Orthodox Church, where
sure.
chrismation is going to be joined with baptism and not separated as it is in the West. And of course, infants are going to be communicated. How does that work, since you have this Eastern patrimony and Western patrimony mixing kind of?
Yeah. We do paedo communion, so we immediately chrismate when we baptize an infant. They're baptized, chrismated, and serve communion all in the same
Is this through
service.
intinction, or how is that done?
Yeah, for an infant, I will take the host and we will do intinction, and then sort of they can't swallow, a
Mhm.
particle, so we'll put it in their mouth,
Mhm.
and then give it to the parent, actually.
Gotcha. So you're not going to use the liturgical spoon or anything like that.
No, we don't use a spoon. I think there might be some people who do, but the Western Rite and the Antiochian Church don't use a spoon. We typically intinct those. Yeah.
Okay. Well, there was a question that, ordinarily Eric Ibarra is here as a co-host, and he had a couple questions that he wanted to ask. So let me ask a few of those on his behalf. Um, he asks that there are a lot of criticisms from Byzantine Orthodox theologians about the heresy of original sin, the wrath of God, legal satisfaction, penal substitution, penance, and so on and so on. So does Western Orthodoxy avoid these so-called errors, or would you see a room for them?
A room for error? No room for error.
Right,
No,
right, right.
no
Okay,
room for error.
okay,
No,
okay.
this is one of my, this is, yeah, I'm glad you brought this is one of my sort of soapbox issues.
Mhm,
I'm really interested in liturgical theology and issues on the atonement and Christology. That's pretty much, those are the things I care about in reverse
mhm,
order. Christology would be number one, and the atonement, and then liturgical theology. That's why the Western Rite's so important. It's because the Latin Mass presents Christ's atoning work in a distinct way from the Byzantine liturgy. I'm just going to throw that out there for a minute and then get to your
mhm.
question. But that's one reason why, the Latin having a living Latin Mass in the Orthodox experience, the life of the Orthodox Church, is so important. Is this does directly affect your question, because within Orthodoxy, Eastern Orthodoxy, some of these models or metaphors or understandings, these pictures, narratives of Christ's atoning work have been lost. They've been jettisoned, really, in some violent way sometimes, and it's even caused people to sort of disembowel even parts of the scriptures and sort of sweep them under the rug. I mean, we're guilty, really, of what we accuse the Protestants of throwing the baby out with the bathwater. We've done the same thing. We've allowed sort of our opponents, those that we disagree with theologically, to define the terms and about whether it's wrath or substitution or satisfaction. These kinds of terminology are different models of the atonement. I heard we've allowed them to define the terms, and then we've just thrown them out and said this is not orthodox. And in so doing, we're actually jettisoning portions of the scripture, large portions of the scripture that are important. And I think that we're in danger of altering our very understanding of God and God's work in Christ and his death upon the cross, and succumbing even, I would say, to some postmodernism, because we're afraid to talk about the wrath of God or certain things. So I consider this to be a really tragic and important issue that needs to be addressed. And I'm encouraged because I think there are a lot of Orthodox folks who are coming around to recognizing this as a problem. They're speaking up about it. You go on social media and there's a lot of very, very bright, educated, savvy, Orthodox folks who are saying, wait a minute here, to say that there's no wrath or there's a very popular Orthodox teacher who does YouTube videos, who recently came out with a topic. These are the Western models of the atonement that are unorthodox and heterodox. And the first one he listed was the ransom theory. And I'm thinking, what are you talking about? The ransom theory? This is like patristic. The fathers talk about this. The Eastern fathers.
Yeah.
And he was condemning this as a Western innovation. So there's a lot of confusion. I recently, during Lent, I had a lot of time to think about the cross, and I was thinking a lot about these issues. And when it comes to God's wrath, it's God's wrath that saves us, because it's God's wrath poured out against our enemy, sin and death. He goes and destroys sin and death by his wrath to rescue us and to deliver us. So when you begin to understand it in that way, it takes on a different character. And satisfaction. Christ satisfied. Christ did what needed to be done in order for us to be cleansed, expiated, and so that's the essential nature of satisfaction. I mean, it's really not complicated. He satisfied the metaphysical, ontological requirements for our salvation. Substitution, that one's pretty simple. We obviously couldn't save ourselves. We couldn't offer a pure and holy sacrifice to the Father, which would restore communion between God and man. We couldn't deify humanity. So he did it. That's substitution. So these ideas are perfectly orthodox, and it's important that we, I think, see them in that way.
Okay. Well, you note that, a lot of this is basically reactionary theology and is not very indicative of true Orthodox theology. So what would you say are some real differences that still divide Roman Catholics and Eastern Orthodox?
Well, I think the differences have been really polarized, but there are some. For me, the liturgy, the modern liturgy of the Catholic Church is hugely problematic. The Protestantization of the liturgy, and just the lack of solemnity and reverence, the whole ethos. I think that's hugely problematic. If we were to ever work through some of our doctrinal differences, I think that would be the big stumbling block in a lot of people's minds. I think the papal doctrines are probably at the top of the list. You know, if those got worked out, I think everything else could potentially, you know, with God, all things are possible. I mean, I don't see it happening, but I mean, I'm just a country parish priest. I try and take care of my family and my parish and work on my salvation. I mean, that's the level of my responsibility. You know, I don't assume anything, you know, matters that are too high for me.
Right.
But it seems to me like if the papal doctrines could get resolved, the other stuff could get worked out. You know, I don't see anything doctrinally that you know would prevent, other than the papal doctrines, that could prevent a restoration of communion. You know, it's obviously would be a gargantuan, you know, feat, and only God could do it. But you know, treasury of merits. I mean, merits are completely orthodox, So we use the term merits in our mass. They go back very early. Ambrose was using the term merits. The whole idea of merits is fully orthodox. If you don't embrace merits, you don't embrace the solidarity of human nature. You don't embrace, you know, the triune one God. I mean, this is the necessary metaphysical foundation for salvation and love and the unity of the human race with God is merit. The idea of merits, they're all tied together. Our problem is with the treasury of merits, like how they're doled out, and indulgences. So, you know, without being an expert on that, and I don't want to malign my Catholic brethren, but as far as I understand, that troubles me. You know, I'm okay with merits. I just don't like the indulgences and the treasury of merits and how that. So,
and those
so
issues
that.
really go to the papacy.
Yeah.
So, I mean, in regards to the papacy, you think that, you know, Vatican I and Eastern Orthodoxy, at least seemingly, cannot be reconciled apart from a miracle of God. Would that be accurate?
That's sure the way it looks. You know, Olivier Clément, he's a well-known Orthodox theologian in France. He wrote a little book, Thou Art Peter. And he's very ironic towards the Roman Catholics. And in that book, he said something I read years ago that fascinated me. He talked about how Pope John Paul floated this idea that maybe that because of the split and the separation, God gifted the Western Church with a special charism of infallibility, but that this was a temporary charism, and that when the church came back together, East and West, that they would no longer need this charism because we'd have conciliarity, and it could be, and that maybe would be a way of resolving, you know, the papal doctrines. Obviously, the Orthodox are never going to.
Well, let me
go
maybe
for that.
ask a follow
Go
up
for
to
that, but
yeah, I don't think so.
No, they're not going to go. But it's a sweet sentiment. I mean, it's like, okay, you know, he's looking for some avenue, some way to get through this impasse.
I think he's reaching a little too far because here's maybe one of the questions that I would have. It does appear that we will find some of the Western and maybe even some of the Eastern parts of the church prior to the schism affirming papal infallibility. So that doesn't mean that it's right, but you will find that among certain segments. So this does seem to predate the schism. What would you say about, you know, perhaps a father who affirmed a form of papal infallibility in the patristic era? Would you say that this was maybe just a theolegumena at the time and he was just, turns out he was mistaken? Or would you just say that in fact didn't happen?
Well, I'm going to sidestep your question a little bit. I'm going to answer it, but sidestep it just a little bit. So, because I'm not an expert in these matters, but this is what I have to offer in response to your question. This is a matter of ecclesiology, right? Between Roman Catholics and Orthodox, and the way that I look at it, I feel like if it's possible for us to bring ourselves closer together, if that's possible and still hold to our integrity, then we need to do it. Like, it's incumbent upon us, according to Christian charity, to do that. And so I'm taking a very opposite approach many people take.
Right.
Like, I believe that that's pleasing to God, and that the alternative is not pleasing to God. Like, I used to do the other, and I repented of that years ago because I felt like it was sinful. So I don't know how to be any more direct than that. So let's look at the ecclesiology issue. Both the Roman Catholics and the Orthodox believe in some sense that the church is infallible, right? Because the church is the temple of the Holy Spirit. The Spirit is the Spirit of truth, who was given to the church and promised that he would lead the church into all truth. And that in some sense, in a sort of grand final sense, the church is infallible. Well, the only difference is we recognize that infallibility working through different channels and instruments than Rome. Not different, actually. They include the same channels and instruments, but Rome came to see that sort of final arbitration in the papacy.
So I'm assuming you would say this organ of infallibility that both Rome and Orthodox would agree on would be an ecumenical council. Would you say that's accurate?
Yeah, I mean, it's not just the councils, it's the whole, it's the life of the Spirit in the church. It includes it all. It's really the Holy Spirit. I mean, I'm going to sound like a crazy charismatic, right? It's the Spirit. It's the life of the Spirit in the church, working through the council, the scriptures, the consensus of the fathers, the hymnography, the liturgical tradition, iconography. You know, for the Catholics, the magisterium. You know, Orthodox don't like that term, but you know, I think we make too much over that. So, you know, so it's all of it. But for the Roman Catholics, they tried to come up, you know, well, that sounds silly. There's this insurance, like we've got this one final arbitration of these things, which is going to ensure that we have the right answer on everything, you know, and that's the papacy. So if you look at the difference, I have a little picture. If you imagine a circle, and at the top of the circle, it's broken by 1 degree. And you have a dot at the beginning and a dot at the end. And one dot is the Orthodox Church and the other dot is the Roman Catholic Church. And they're separated. And you could say that they are 359 degrees apart. But you could also say they're 1 degree apart at the same time. And I think this issue of ecclesiology is a good example of that. People talk about how different we are in our ecclesiology, and they try and paint the picture as if we're, you know, like two different religions, like we're 359 degrees apart. Whereas, depending on how you look at this, you really could say that we're 1 degree apart. I mean, in essence, we have the same ecclesiology apart from that final arbiter being the papacy.
Okay. Would you say that there is a final arbiter for Eastern Orthodoxy, however? Would it be an ecumenical council? And if so, how does an Orthodox identify what is ecumenical?
I have no idea.
Right.
I mean, you know, I mean, it's no secret. It's no secret. I mean, I'm not qualified to really give a erudite answer to that. I think that if you ask our most, you know, brilliant historians and theologians, they would give you a good answer, but they'd stumble around doing it. I mean, it's messy. I mean, how do you know a council is ecumenical? Well, you don't. Eventually, you do. But you don't at first. Some people say, well, by reception. If it's received as ecumenical, then it's ecumenical. Well, that's only part of it. That's sort of part of the answer, but that's not the whole answer. It's not that simple. And so I think it's rather complex. And people that want, you know, very clean, precise, tidy answers to these questions generally become Roman Catholic.
Let me ask you a few questions from the chat, if that's okay.
Sure.
Daniel from the chat asks, why do Orthodox consider the Roman Catholic understanding of the beatific vision to be heretical? Are you able to maybe speak on that a little bit?
I have no idea. I mean, I think I mean, I guess they're referring to the essence energies distinction and
Yes.
the two modes of God's of the knowledge of God, and so I suppose that's what they're they're
Right. Yeah. And
referring to.
that's exactly what it is. Really, this goes back to a prior debate, and that's between, the issue of Aquinas and Gregory Palamas. So
Right.
this is basically going to be whichever side you land on will determine what understanding of the beatific vision you'll have, because Orthodox have a version of the beatific vision. Gregory Palamas has it. It's just different than Aquinas, because Aquinas sees the intellect as the highest faculty of man. So his eternity is going to be spent having the vision of God, and that's mainly going to take place by grace through his highest faculty, the intellect. But those who would affirm Palamas would see things differently, and they would see that the vision with God is going to be something that takes place through the nous and not actually through the intellect. At least that's the way I understand it. So I think that's why there's going to be some Orthodox who would take issue with Roman Catholics on it. However, there are others who seem to, say that these are basically distinctions that are on the level of theolegumena, so that they are not actually, really church dividing.
Right.
At least that's the impression I get. Kyle from the chat asks, what proof is there that the Western Rite and Eastern Orthodoxy is the same one as St. Gregory the Great's liturgy?
What proof is there? I, well, I don't know that anybody really overly contests this. We have sacramentaries that are in the West that are as old, I think, older than the Byzantine sacramentaries, actually. And the Western liturgy has gone through less change, ceremonial and ritual change, than the Eastern Rite, actually, much less.
Yeah.
So the West was much more liturgically conservative. I mean, I think this is pretty accepted common knowledge among scholars and historians. I don't think anybody even contests this. So,
yeah, I don't think so. If you're using the Roman Missal, you're basically using a liturgy that does go back to Gregory the Great. And you can just simply consult Adrian Fortescue on that. He has a book on the Mass who kind of walks you through step by step historically how they went from Gregory the Great until the Council of Trent. And so if you're using the Roman Missal that essentially came from the Council of Trent, you're within that lineage going back to Gregory the Great. Although you do note that y'all have made a few differences. You've added the epiclesis, which maybe if you could briefly speak to that. Why did the Orthodox Church feel the need to add the epiclesis when it wasn't there in the Roman Rite historically? Was this something that y'all believed was essential to the Mass, and the Catholics didn't have something that was essential?
Well, so I'm not 100% sure if that's the reason it was added. I hope not, personally, because I don't think it should be there. But well, let me say it certainly shouldn't be there because the Mass is deficient without it. Let me put it that way. It's there because it was our bishops added. So
Right.
I'm in obedience to our bishops. So
Sure.
I trust that, I'm not going to complain about it. But if anybody gets the idea that it's there because the Mass is deficient without it, that I would take serious issue with that position. So my understanding is that Alexander Turner, who was involved in the late 19th century in terms of trying to establish a Western Rite, that he actually requested that it be inserted. And I don't know his reasoning. I don't know why he did that. It could have been, it may not have been because he felt it was deficient without it. It may have been more of a political issue, because this was a polemical issue between East and West. There were some Byzantines who claimed that the Western Mass was deficient because it didn't have an epiclesis, which is almost as, in my view, is almost as silly as when the Latins rebuked the East for not having for removing the filioque from the creed.
Right.
It's almost a parallel to that.
Yeah.
It's that silly.
Yeah.
Because it wasn't there. And there were early liturgies of the church that didn't have an epiclesis, so I guess they were
Right.
all invalid,
Yeah. And there was one that didn't have the words of institution.
The Armenian,
So-
yeah, the Armenian Rite. So, the epiclesis what migrated into the liturgy from the Syrian baptismal liturgies, as I understand it. I do intend on studying this in more depth at some point, because this comes up so often, and it's been an issue I think that needs to be more deeply addressed. But there were many historical apostolic liturgies without an epiclesis. And I think, to get to my sort of like folk wisdom on this, because that's really where I end up going to as a country priest. My folk wisdom on this is that it is absurd to suggest that there's some competition between Jesus Christ, the eternal Word, transforming the elements, the gifts, by the word of the priest, who is speaking as the Word, and the Holy Spirit coming down, being called down upon the gifts, as if there's some competition between the two.
Right.
It's insane. This is a Trinitarian act of offering, and the Spirit and the Son are in complete, completely unified in this act of transformation of the gifts and to the Father, and it is Trinitarian. And so when we start to sort of like posit this sort of competition between the words of institution and the epiclesis, it's just the height of absurdity in my mind. And I'm going to draw a link, and I don't know, I'm probably reaching here, but I think something could possibly be made out of this. The other big elephant in the room is the filioque, of course, which we haven't talked about. But again, back to my sort of folk wisdom on this. Whatever the eggheads finally decide is right about the filioque issue, because a lot of Orthodox theologians I know say it's no longer the issue that it used to be. But whether or not it is, I don't know. But the point is, if we're so busy condemning the filioque that we never develop a strong doctrine, or we don't preach on the relationship between the Son and the Spirit, then we will have lost something incredibly important. Because for me, as a pastor, this is of singular importance to our salvation. Singular importance is preaching on the role of the Spirit to Christify us, and Christ, the Spirit, as Paul calls the Spirit of Jesus. The Spirit is a distinct person in the Holy Trinity. Doesn't mean that he's the Spirit of Jesus, like, Chris has a spirit or I have a spirit. He means that the Spirit in his mission is to Christify us, is to make us little Christs. And I'm using the term Christify in the same way that an Orthodox person would use the word deify, except I think Christify is actually more accurate, because he's the one true human being. And we were created, Adam was created in the image of the Christ who was to come. And for us to be fully alive, full human beings, to reach our telos, our perfection, our completion, is to be Christified. And this is a work of the Spirit. And so I think that, in this big controversy over the filioque, one of the mistakes that maybe we've made on a practical level is by spending all of our energy combating, the filioque, or what we think is a heretical understanding of the filioque. We failed to really teach and proclaim with real vigor, which it needs to be proclaimed, the true Orthodox filioque, the true relationship between, because there is an Orthodox filioque, as everybody will admit. But we need to be preaching that. That needs to be central to our message and our ministry in terms of our lives right now in our salvation. So when you sort of compare that to this whole controversy over words of institution versus epiclesis, I almost see a parallel there. I don't know if that makes any sense.
Sure.
I haven't talked much about this, publicly, but
Yeah.
I've been thinking about this parallel between these two controversies and how in both cases, it is, really taking our eyes off of the relationship between the Spirit and the Son, and that is of singular importance to our salvation in this life.
Yeah. Another question that we have is, what is the Orthodox view of Saint Augustine, and also what is your perspective of Thomas Aquinas?
Well, my favorite quote about Saint Augustine is by Father Florovsky, who has, in writing, has written in a letter that he considers Saint Augustine to be the greatest saint of the Church.
Mm.
So that's pretty shocking. I love it. I really get a lot of joy out of repeating that, actually.
Mm.
I'm just grieved at how he's just drugged through the mud. This great saint of the Church. So I love Augustine. And Aquinas, I'm learning about Aquinas. I actually think very highly of Aquinas. I think Marcus Plested's book on Aquinas was outstanding. I've read at it. I haven't completed it yet, but he also has some really good lectures on YouTube. I think he spent 13-14 years devoted to this topic of rehabilitating Aquinas in the Orthodox mind.
Right.
Who was really revered by the Greeks when he was translated.
Sure was.
And, back to the whole essence energies distinction. My question again for people is, was Aquinas caught up into, an experience of God? Was he or wasn't he? I mean, I don't think you can read Aquinas or sing his hymns. Personally, I think he was. So whether you have a problem with the way that he described the beatific vision or even the essence energies distinction, my question is did he experience the energies of God? I think he did.
He was very much of a mystic, and as you noted, his the contemporary Orthodox very much praised him. A lot of them did.
Right.
It seems like Augustine and Aquinas have kind of gotten a bad rap in the last few centuries, but that wasn't necessarily the historical Orthodox position.
No.
That takes us to the next question. Is it possible to reconcile Aquinas and Palamas?
I'm not qualified to answer that question. I wish I could. That's one of those things that's sort of on my to-do list. Like, like
it's a complicated topic. It's rough. It will be interesting. I'm going to have Father Peter Tottleben, who is a Dominican priest. He's going to be on the show pretty soon, and he actually wrote either a master's or a doctoral thesis, or one of the documents for his ecclesiastical degrees or something like that. He wrote a long paper about the differences between Palamas and Aquinas when it comes to this topic. And essentially he concludes that the two cannot be reconciled. However, they do not reach the level of church dividing. So they are still within the realm of theology. So it's an issue that Orthodox and Catholics can agree to disagree on. Right. So it might be interesting to hear him talk about it when he comes on the show. Let's see if there's any other questions. Anybody else has any, go ahead and put it in the chat now. Otherwise, I'm going to ask a few more that I have, and then we'll wrap it up. Let's see here. Well, let me ask a couple that I have. When you do the Mass, do you do it in Latin or is it in English?
It's in English, in the vulgar language, as they say.
Okay, yeah. So, have you ever done it in Latin, or is it's always in English?
No, some of our priests say the Latin Mass. Maybe they do it from time to time. In Latin, it would never be done consistently that way. But maybe they have a low Mass once a month in Latin or something. But I haven't done that yet. No.
Okay. Another question that I had for you is, has Western Orthodoxy got off the ground as an official movement, and where is it going? Actually, this is a question on behalf of Eric.
I would say certainly yes. I mean, we're here. We're not going anywhere. It's not large, but it's vibrant and growing. I charismated 12 people this year at Pascha. I have another, dozen in the pipeline or so. And our church is growing and healthy, and we're looking at a new building project. I think there are 50 plus parishes in the United States between us and ROCOR's jurisdiction. There are other jurisdictions overseas that are establishing Western Rite communities, and so it's very small, but this is our life. I had daily mass through Lent. I'm at the church at 5:45 a.m. every single day, saying the office. It's very difficult for us to conceive of. This is just our life. This is what we live every day. We're not looking at this from the outside and wondering if, this project's going to make it or not.
Mm-hmm.
It's hard to even see it in that way. So I think it has tremendous potential. Tremendous potential, in the West. So it's just a matter of administration is a big key. Right. Getting our act together with administration. I think that it could be a little threatening to Orthodox folks. So there could be some resistance. Quite frankly, to be honest, personally, I've received very little personal resistance.
Good.
The priests in my diocese, our bishops, are 100% supportive. I mean, unbelievably supportive. I have experienced little to no resistance from within my own church, my own archdiocese, and very little among my other pan-Orthodox brother priests. There's a lot of ignorance, a fair amount, quite a bit of indifference, a little bit of hostility, but not a lot. I was surprised. Good. I was surprised at how little hostility I encountered when we became Western Rite.
Good. Another question that we have in the chat is: do Orthodox see contraception as a decision belonging to the domestic of economia and not objective moral law?
Well, I think if you ask most Orthodox folks, they would say that this is a matter between you're going to get different answers. So it's this is one of the problems with not having a pope. I suppose, if we had a pope, then we got an answer, and that's that. And there's some Orthodox who say, "Wow, they look in a situation like this, they look longingly across the Tiber." But because you've got priests who say unequivocally, that we have the same position as the Roman Catholics, and you have other Orthodox priests who would say that there is an issue of economia, and this is between the spiritual father and his spiritual child to discuss and decide pastorally what's best. So I think that you're going to hear both those answers. But let me just add this because I think it's important. Regardless, even with the second answer, we can say unequivocally across the board that the Orthodox Church certainly does teach that married couples need to be having children, and people don't get married so they can just jet set around the world and have vacations and live it up. I mean, God brought families together to have kids, and lots of kids.
Right. So it wouldn't necessarily be an affirmation of contraception without exception.
Right.
Looks like there's a couple questions for me. Ian asks, do you think that the Orthodox Western Rite has something to offer the Roman Catholic Church liturgically? Absolutely. Father, I was watching a few of your videos, liturgical videos online. It was done very well, very solemn, very reverent. I think that is needed in the Roman Catholic Church. As you noted earlier, the liturgy and the life of the church, especially the liturgy, the Roman Catholic Church has been pretty poor. And so I think that, if a Roman Catholic were to see a Western Orthodox liturgy, they might actually be a little more encouraged to step it up liturgically. I think y'all were doing, I want to say you were doing Ad Orientem as well. Is that correct?
Oh, yes. Yeah.
Yeah, so you're doing ad orientem. You have very solemn vestments on. It's done very reverently. It looks like the communicants were kneeling when they were receiving.
Yes. Yeah.
So I definitely see this as something positive, no doubt. Looks like there's another question. As a Roman Catholic, what do you think of the Western Rite? Do you think it is a positive movement within the Orthodox Church? I do think that the Western Rite is a positive movement within the Orthodox Church for one of the reasons that I just mentioned earlier. I think that it shows the universality of Orthodoxy a little more than just the Byzantine liturgy. But that's just my personal opinion. That's not to say that Eastern Orthodoxy wouldn't have any universality apart from a Western liturgy. I just think that the Western Rite shows it a little bit more. I don't think we have any more questions. Father, did you have any closing thoughts or concluding thoughts that you wanted to give?
Well, I don't know. Do you have a final question for me?
Well,
anything you want to revisit?
Well, kind of an off the wall question that I'll ask here, just as the last question. I generally try to get an understanding of the Council of Dositheus from an Orthodox perspective. What would you say about the Council of Dositheus? It's, of course, the Council of Jerusalem, 1672. I'm sorry, the Confession of Dositheus. It was the Council of Jerusalem in 1672, and it affirms a lot of the more Roman Catholic leaning positions within Eastern Orthodoxy. Would you say that that was a good council and that it's authoritative within Orthodoxy, or would you say that, an Orthodox Christian can feel free to dispense with assent to that council?
No, I think it's a great council, and I think that it does carry authority and weight. So I think that it's very convenient for anti-Western polemicists within Orthodoxy to just sort of trash that council, or not trash it, but sort of dismiss it as being sort of, again, part of Western captivity. So I reject that.
Good. Yeah, there's a lot of, we noted earlier, those who are kind of reactionary theologians, and it seems like they really don't like that council. So,
oh yeah, I mean, it's just like the Protestants didn't like the Ignatian epistles when they came to light.
Right.
I mean, they were predicting the end of Protestantism, which of course didn't happen. But
right. Yeah.
So
well, Father, tell us how viewers may reach you or contact you in the future.
Sure. So they can go onto our church website is stpatrickorthodox.org. And I also am in charge, the founder and administrator of our Western Rite Vicariate website, which is orthodoxwest.com, orthodoxwest.com. And there's a lot of information on there. The liturgies are on there, praxis, all our devotional life, what we, in terms of praying the rosary and adoration and all of these Eucharistic devotions that we do, Stations of the Cross. So sort of you can get a feel for the devotional life of a Western Rite Orthodox person. You can see the liturgy. We have some scholarly articles in the journal page on there about various topics that are very interesting. And about the history of the church. So that's a great resource. And we also have a YouTube page with a lot of videos on it, St. Patrick Orthodox YouTube, Western Rite Orthodox YouTube page. And so we post videos of our masses and various services that we have at the church, so you can get a taste for the music and sort of the aesthetic and the solemnity of the mass as it's done there at our church. So.
Well, excellent. Well, thank you, Father, so much for coming on the show. I really enjoyed it. I hope we get to do it again.
Yeah, thank you for having me. Enjoyed it, and God bless you.
Thank you, Father. And viewers, please like, comment, subscribe, share this video. Just a heads up, we're going to have Dr. Adam J. DeVille on the show on Thursday. And so he's going to be talking about orthodoxy and the Roman papacy. I want to say he did his doctoral thesis on it. So he's going to be discussing the distinctions and differences there between Orthodox and Roman Catholics on the papacy. So please tune into that. But until next time, go share your faith, everyone.